Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Hanovi Schoonover, Operations Specialist at Redmond Consulting, and I'll be hosting this webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redmond is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including, but not limited to, Tribal Governments Comprehensive, Responding to Urban Natives, and Elder Abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. That's HONOVI at red-wind.net. You can also visit our website at red-wind.net for additional information on services we provide, upcoming events, and resources such as handouts and guidebooks that you can download. As this states, this project is supported by grant number 15J OVW 21GK 02197 STOP, awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, or exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. This webinar is a part of our Responding to Urban Natives program. And joining us today is Vicki Ybanez, the Executive Director of Redmond Consulting. So this event does have captioning, which you'll need to manually turn on from the menu. The button will look like two C's. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box or the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, or you can click the hand icon. You'll all be muted, so if we see the hand, we can then unmute you so that you can ask your question or say your comment verbally. If there are any tech issues, you can send a private message to me and we'll try to get it resolved as soon as possible. And I'll now turn it over to Vicki.
Thank you, Hanovi, and welcome everybody. I'm really glad you could join us today. This is the second part of a two-part webinar mini-series on Cornerstone to successful advocate program planning. And previously we talked about some of the basic getting started work, and this time we're going to focus on core program components as you're looking at responses to victims of urban Native victims of domestic and sexual violence. And next slide, Hanovi. So when we think about core program components, just at its very basic are the crisis response to victims, safety for victims, confidentiality, which is a cornerstone for safety, and recovery from violence. And I'll walk through all four of those. As programs develop and evolve, they're going, oftentimes programs are going to increase the program components that they provide, but we're going to focus on the very basics. When we think of this particular webinar session, we're focusing on Native programs that are developing responses to victims. So putting in place the very beginning stages of an advocacy program. Next slide, please. So when we think about the advocate response, we want to realize the role of an advocate. A lot of times when people are thinking about the crisis response and the work engaged with survivors of violence, people think about it as a social service response. And I just really want to be clear, it's different. While we are working with people and providing services, that our activities that we're engaged in are different than social services. So the advocate role is somewhat unique to domestic and sexual violence. The advocate helps survivors asserting their rights. And so as a part of it, they're informed survivors of their rights so that they know that they have a right in different kinds of areas, and helping them to speak up on what they need. Advocates are responding to victims with special needs and understanding how those needs impact the systems the victims may interact with, medical, legal, etc. And when we think about urban Native survivors, when we look at those different needs, they're different than non-Native survivors, because Native people have unique legal needs that they are faced with in urban areas. For instance, Indian child welfare is one particular area that comes up periodically as a part of thinking about the different needs of survivors. And when we talk about like Indian child welfare, it's the fact that a survivor seeking help for violence, there are times they can get introduced into a social service system for help and assistance, and out of that end up in a situation where there's an attempt to remove the children from a household as a result of the violence. Trying, with people trying to have good intentions to protect children, but when we look at it, that protecting children in a situation with removal of children from a victim is they're not really protecting them from the right person. Most of the time it's, the person who's abusing, they're the ones who are creating endangerment. And ICWA is one of the remedies for urban Native survivors to make sure that if children are removed, that they stay connected to their tribe, to their people. So when we think about special needs, we want to understand a whole range of different special needs that can play out. Another one I just want to mention briefly here is about full faith and credit of protection orders. We find that victims who have tribal protection orders struggle in urban areas to have those protection orders honored. And I was just having a conversation with one of my coworkers talking about that and how it creates a bigger burden on survivors when an urban area is not recognizing tribal protection orders, and in fact they're supposed to through the Violence Against Women Act. So an advocate has to understand all of these different kinds of issues, and in that, as they're working across those different needs that survivors have or victims have, they're informing the survivors of medical and forensic services that are available and explaining, what can happen if they're reaching out for that kind of help. They're explaining the civil legal remedies that are available and explaining what can occur. And then an advocate, as a part of being able to explain what can occur, those different steps, different parts of the process, the advocate needs to understand the procedures of the system that they may come in contact with. And then helping survivors access civil legal remedies, they need to know how to do that so that they can be helpful for survivors in needing to reach out to that. And then the advocate also works with survivors in accessing community resources, and as they're informing the survivors of the community resources available for them, with emotional support, but other things such as financial assistance, different kinds of resources that can support the household during relocation, or shortfalls of economic needs because the abuser is no longer in the household, different things like that. So the survivor has multiple different needs, and the advocate needs to know how to be able to access those resources and have meaningful relationships to help facilitate smooth access to those resources with those partners. Next slide, please. So when we think about the crisis response, there are some core areas in there. So we want to make sure that the response is trauma informed and relative centered. And so when we talk about being trauma informed, is that we're recognizing that the survivor is living with trauma and as a result of the violence. And that's going to look different for different survivors in terms of the way they may present that. I've seen survivors that come in and because of the violence, they have kind of a flat effect. They're kind of emotionless, where their emotions have been stunted or squashed as a part of the abuse. So they are not expressing joy and happiness just as well as they're not expressing sadness and fear, just kind of a monotone flatness. Other survivors may come in and have a lot of humor that you kind of go like, geez, you've gone through some really hard stuff and you're laughing all the time. That's a coping mechanism or a survival skill. And so survivors also may come in and be really angry. And while their angry is rooted in their response to the violence and what's happening in their life, it may be directed toward us, or other systems and stuff. And so as a trauma-informed response, we need to be able to recognize it, not take it personal, not judge the survivor about how they should be feeling, how they should be acting, and help guide them in gentle ways to the different kind of supports that may be available to them. And also in trauma-informed, that we meet survivors, we're meeting survivors where they're at. And when I say in gentle ways, programs, we have structures that we have to function in where our funding comes from. We want to make sure that we're not overwhelming people, and we're walking them through things. And I've heard people over the years say, oh, we don't want to, create any codependency, so we just make referrals. And my response to that is that we aren't creating codependency by helping people. Think about somebody in your life who has gone through a very traumatic event, a crisis in their life. And as we look at someone that we know, we care about, that has experienced a large crisis in their life, it was challenging at times for them to make decisions, challenging for them to take steps in their life, to go through, make appointments and different kinds of things like that. So for us as advocates, we're working with people in similar situations with that, and maybe even worse situations because of the layers of violence that they have lived with through domestic violence or sexual violence that has impacted them physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. So our trauma-informed and relative-centered response is we are treating this person as a relative that's gone through something really hard. We're offering them a cup of tea, offering them opportunity to rest, and gently moving forward with them at the pace that they can move. And then we are able to respond quickly to victims' needs. So if a victim is saying, we're relocating, we didn't have any clothes, we need to help them get some changes of clothes. We need to help them get some toiletries. We need to make sure that the children, if they're not in the same school district, can get connected to a school district. So we want to make sure that we're prepared for a quick turnaround. And then what are the options for a victim for fleeing? So if as crisis response, oftentimes at its basic level, may not have those options in place for a survivor, or maybe the program is starting with some clear resources to help somebody with fleeing the violence. But regardless, we need to know what's available, whether it's within our program or outside of our program. Are there other resources in the community that can help with hotel stays or bus tickets, or is there a shelter that's safe for this household to flee to? And what's the process? How do we help transition them into it as smoothly as possible? And then we also have to know what we can do around safety. Fleeing is one aspect of it, but there are many people that we will work with that are not immediately leaving an abusive relationship. And we have to realize that that's a very big decision for people to make, to leave an abusive relationship. So when we think about options for safety, we want to be able to help a survivor look at what's going on in their life. Where are they at? How can they be safe in this situation? And can they leave and go temporarily to a friend's house or a relative's house? And can they do it, can they just flee to go that and do that? Or are there ways that they can be safe in their own home? Or maybe they can leave the home for short periods of time and maybe, with the excuse of I need to run an errand and go, or I'm going to go buy groceries, or, I have an appointment at the school or something like that. And we'll work with them on how to be safe in their home, how to be safe and how to help keep their children safe, and how to prepare to exit. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And then victim autonomy. We want to make sure that we understand in the work as an advocate in our crisis response to survivors of domestic and sexual violence that it is their choice. They're the ones who live with the outcomes and the consequences of their decisions. So we support their choices, and our job is to help them to see their options. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the trauma-informed approach. We look at survivor empowerment. When we look at the violence and its impact, one of the things that happens is people have been experienced violence that is rooted in power and control. And so there has been a disempowerment that survivors have experienced. And so we want to work with survivors in a way that uses individual strengths to empower them in the development of their care. And so as we identify different options, we help educate them. Survivor autonomy is a clear part of survivor empowerment, because survivors are making their own choices. And sometimes someone will come back and they will say, well, just tell me what to do. But we don't live with those outcomes. So we want to make sure they understand that they have to make those choices. And there's so many different choices that they can make or need to make. And so we want to help them figure out, like, maybe focus on this area first, and then we can work on this other stuff tomorrow or next week or later. And help them see what's critical and what's a little less critical to figure out that difference. Because somebody who's been living with violence, everything at that point, it becomes critical for them. So choice, I can't say that enough. Their choice in regarding care options, and being able to help them see that, they're doing a great job making those decisions. And then for us, our collaborations are really, really helpful, to be able to provide the different resources to help with smooth transition. And then also collaboration in a way that we help the survivors see that we're part of their team. Our staff, their families, together, we can help them through this. And not that we're saying bring their families in to help do a plan or something like that, but that we can say, you can talk to your sister about this, and here's some ideas, or, because they've been talking about their sister as being a helpful person, examples like that. And then safety, we're developing places and activities that are safe options for survivors, and provides emotional safety. And so part of it is as they're living with violence, it may even be that we create places for them to go to experience life in a different way. So it might be going to an education group where, yes, we're teaching a little bit of stuff around domestic or sexual violence, but with some pauses. And then we're also doing some hand work, And maybe we're sewing and teaching them how to make ribbon skirts or something else where they're actually feeling emotionally safe. And it feels you feel empowered to accomplish something. And then we build the relationships and that foster trust, having clear expectations with survivors um, about what we're asking them to do, what options are available, what steps are involved, what they can reasonably expect. The more we are clear with them, the more the trust is growing. And part of that clarity is to say, here's the pros and cons of this potential choice or option here. So thinking about a protection order, that it can help to deter violence. And it sometimes, for some abusers, it may not be a good option because it could provoke an abuser. And we want to know what the system is, how they're responding locally. Are they going to really be responsive to a protection order? So we want to foster trust with survivors by helping them to see, here's the potential pitfalls, here's the potential benefits, and help inform them to make some decisions that are helpful for them. Next slide, please. When someone, I'm going to read this quote. When someone comes in asking for help, we take them to a comfortable place. We offer them a cup of tea and ask them if they'd like to rest. And when we have somebody coming in and in crisis, one unhelpful thing to do is to bring a packet of paper and put it in front of them and say, let's do an intake and then we'll talk. Let's complete these forms first. Fill out the form and tell us what you need, different things like that. That when you're in crisis, you really need some softness around you. Create a space that is soft and comfortable. Find ways to help people find a nice starting point where they feel safe. Next slide, please. So we want to think about safety planning as a core aspect, a core part of the program. And safety planning has some variations across the different crimes. So when we think of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And so safety planning, there are core things about it. So we want to think about, and we're trying to anticipate the actions of the abuser and figuring out what are safe places, what are ways to move away from risk, how to engage the children in ways without giving the children too much information, taking into account developmental ages for children. And in that, when we think of safety, we're thinking safety in the home, safety as the survivor moves around in the community, safety with the children going to school and coming back from school, safety for the children in the home, and going to the grocery store, going to school, going to a job, different kinds of things like that for the household. And so we want to help them develop strategies. Similarly, sexual assault has similar focuses, and then there are some additional safety needs, focusing on looking at responses and triggers that can take a person back to the assault that is very hard for them. So creating emotional and mental safety in those instances, how to ground that person as well. And emotional safety in different spaces. The sexual assault may have occurred in the home, and how do we create emotional safety in that space if that person has to stay in that home. Domestic or dating violence also has some other uniques, and some of these all kind of interchange across all of them, but we see more emphasis in different areas. But dating violence, we will see more stuff happening with social media, and in the social community that can be used to further abuse and traumatize the survivor. So we want to think about some safety options for a survivor within those contexts. And that may mean, blocking people, closing your account, starting a new one with very limited, a closer circle of people, so you can still be connected on social media, but yet not be subjected to some of the ways that the abuser will act. And then also with dating violence, sometimes there's people around a person that is experiencing dating violence, whether it's teen dating violence or young adult dating violence. Some adults around those victims may not take some of that dating violence serious because they're not understanding how this kind of violence can happen in a dating relationship. And then stalking has its own unique issues. And one of the challenges with stalking is that oftentimes some of the acts that are taking place with stalking in and of themselves individually are not actually breaking the law, but they are creating a pattern where the person who is being stalked is fearful. And so we want to help them think about how they can keep themselves safe, how they can document information to demonstrate that pattern of behavior that is causing them fear, and and how can they be safer. So is that stalker coming to their home, coming into their work environment, coming to public spaces that they move about, and how we can create tracking for that to help them be safe. Next slide, please. So I want to briefly talk about the two kinds of confidentiality. Confidentiality is one of the cornerstones for safety, and it is very critical. And the type of confidentiality that we as advocates have is even stricter than HIPAA requirements that happen in the medical field. So a lot of people say, yeah, if we do HIPAA, then we're good. And it's protective, but not protective enough. And the reason confidentiality has become so critically important is that some abusers, and what we know about domestic violence is that it's a pattern of coercive behavior, and it escalates over time. So, and with abusers, what we have seen is that or with safety for victims, we want to keep victims that have left the abusive relationship safe, so they can make choices in their life. And as they are staying in the abusive relationship, we know that if the abuser perceives that the victim has made a decision to leave or has decided to leave, the risk for lethality increases significantly. So we have to keep the information that we receive very, very, very confidential. So the two kinds of confidentiality is absolute confidentiality. And that means that we as an advocate have received information and it goes nowhere else. And then relative confidentiality is where it gets shared. It could be shared with another coworker on a need-to-know basis, as they're covering as a backup advocate for that victim. It could be shared through a release of information that victim signs and set a signed informed consent specific release that is time limited. to another agency. And when that information goes to the agency, the advocate program no longer has control over it. And then also it can be released under subpoena. If the advocate program has to gets a court order to release information. So the absolute confidentiality when we talk about what stays, like if I'm told something and it stays with me, if you think about what an advocate may need to know to do their job, and I'm transferring this work over to my coworker, there are a lot of details about abuse that coworker doesn't need to know. And I hold it for privacy and dignity for that survivor. I hold those details so that they don't have to keep wondering who knows this information about me, because sometimes people feel shame, sometimes people feel afraid other people are going to know about it, sometimes a victim may feel judged, and so being able to hold on to some of that information is a very critical, important part. And then that relative confidentiality is still controlled and managed in a very tight way to make sure that survivors are protected as closely as possible, so that there's extremely limited chance that information gets to the abuser. And I want to say that confidentiality, if an advocate program is not holding strict confidentiality, and that gets out into the community, it will affect the credibility of the program. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about different methods for providing services. So I've talked about advocacy and the role of the advocate. And I also just touched briefly on education groups, and working with education groups are small groups for survivors to come together. And one big benefit of it is that survivors often think they're alone, and that think like, what is wrong with me that this happens? And when they get the opportunity to hear someone else talk about their story, they can start seeing that they're not alone and start understanding that this wasn't about them. This is about the abusive partner's behavior, and not that they did anything wrong to deserve this. And so it can be a real healing process, and it gives them context for the violence. And it also builds, like we talked about, part of the trauma response is about building empowerment, personal empowerment. The education groups is one of those places which helps builds that sense of personal sovereignty, that strength, their ability to make decisions, understand what's happening to them, and build resiliency so it helps strengthen their ability to respond, respond back and heal from the trauma that they've experienced. Some other activities in providing services are community events. And the community events can educate the community about the crimes that the program works on. And that can be really helpful in terms of being able to reach future survivors that are seeking help, and getting the word out, as well as helping community practitioners and service providers that can be resources for the program to understand the population that you're working with, so that they can actually even make referrals to the program, and also, want to be involved and help and provide resources. And then cultural activities. We really want to center culture in the work that we do. We want to center it in our advocacy, and we can have specific activities as well that provide options for healing from the violence and helps build resiliency and strength. And what we know for Indigenous survivors is that the cultural activities really helps with that resiliency and strength, and is our strongest resource that we have for healing. Well, when we think about healing, we can also make referrals to counselors for therapy or something like that. But being engaged in cultural practices are going to be one of the strongest resources we're going to have for our Indigenous relatives who have experienced violence. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about structure. And so when we talk about structure of the program, there's multiple things we want to have in place, and our policies and protocols are going to be an important part of that. The policies are going to help us in terms of, it's going to help guide the staff in the program. And then also some of the policies are going to help us prepare the documentation that we need to do, and do it in a way that if our information, some of our information gets subpoenaed, that we do little harm or no harm. I should say no harm is our goal. So we minimize the opportunity to harm victims. And we also provide, in that, providing guidance to the staff that we understand clearly what we're doing, and we have a consistency in our practice. So one of the key pieces is our program eligibility. Those of you that may have attended the last webinar on Tuesday, I talked about program scope, which you're describing your program, what you're working on, goals and objectives, different things like that. And program eligibility is to make sure that the people coming to your program to access the resources are in fact the people that are supposed to be coming, the people that you have funding to serve, the people that your program has decided they want to serve, and in that, that the people that are needing the help. So when we talk about, a program that's focused on domestic and sexual violence or sexual violence, program eligibility is going to help to make sure we are serving people that are victims of domestic and or sexual violence, and are not people that are in need of different kinds of resources, but not victims. So we want to have a process in place that can address that. And with that program eligibility, usually that is rolled into our intake information that we collect. And when we think about the intake information, we want to be really clear that we're only collecting the information we need. So there's a couple things in that intake. So I see people ask for, we need social security numbers, we need date of births, we want your current address. If you're staying in a shelter, we want your former address. If you're in a shelter, we want your former address too. Different things like that. We want the school location of your children. We want the names, ages, and social security numbers of your children. And what I want to say is, do you really need all that information? When we think about social security numbers, that's a very highly protected piece of information in terms of, if that gets out, it can be a risk for identity theft. It could be a risk for locating the victim if an abuser finds that information. I mean, there's so many pitfalls with having social security numbers. And do we need those to serve those victims? I would venture to say, no, we don't. And the big piece for me is go back and look at what funding do you have in your program in terms of the information you need to collect, because there may be some guidance, like a progress report form or something like that, that you have to do, and you can look at it. One of the things it wants to know the age range. So you can ask the age of the person. You don't necessarily have to have the birth date. And you can update it like maybe every 6 months if you're working with them on a long-term basis. So you don't have to have a birth date that is personally identifiable. So you really want to think through how to do it in a way that you're not collecting a lot of potentially, it's confidential information in your program, but unnecessary information to do your job. One of the things that an Office on Violence Against Women progress report form will ask for is how, if you have fully served that victim, partially served that victim, or not served that victim. And so what you need to know is, what are the services being requested? So you definitely want that in your intake form if you're funded by OVW. And then financial assistance is a policy that you want to have in place. And with that, you want to think about, what kind of financial assistance do you have resources for? What are the steps that a victim needs to go through to make a request? And how will resources be dispersed? And are there going to be cost limits per victim, or cost limits per activity? Different things like that. And you want to lay that out and write that out. So there's some consistency on it. But I would venture to say, don't get so rigid in terms of what you will cover, so that you cannot cover the things that are necessary. You need to know from your funding sources what's allowable and what's not allowable, and be clear enough so that if it's not listed in a list of such as kind of activities, that if you do something outside of it, that it clearly can say, yeah, this fits in the same theme. And it's not something that's not allowable. And then confidentiality. You want to make sure you have a clear policy for confidentiality that explains to staff what information is protected. So basically, it's personally identifiable information that is very highly protected. And how and when can that information be shared? I mentioned the release of information. You should lay down the procedure for that and have an actual form built in place that meets those needs of time-limited, specific, informed consent for that victim on that release of information. And then, who in your program has access to confidential information? Not every advocate, if you've got 3 advocates in your office, not every advocate should have a right to access all of the information. You want to think about who's doing what. So if you've got an advocate whose job is outreach and community education and education groups, they should not have access to the victim direct service files, because their work is not victim direct service focused. So you want to make sure you really lay that kind of stuff out. Who has access and why they have access to that information. And then how are you going to store that confidential information so it's protected in a locked file cabinet, behind a locked door, what office, who has keys, that kind of stuff. And then your documentation, use your reporting forms with whatever grants for the documentation for what you keep, what procedures you have, and who has access as well. Next slide, please. And then I just got to say, people build policies and procedures, and some, I really encourage you, if there's a similar program nearby, go visit them, go learn from them. And if you get a chance to visit another program or a few programs, ask them for copies of their policies if they're willing to share them, any procedures they're willing to share, any forms they're willing to share, and not to come in and just put them in place, but to get ideas, to see what they do. And the other thing I want to say as a caution in that practice is to make sure that if you're visiting another program and they've been around for 15 years, that you realize that a brand new program doesn't need that extensive list of policies. Theirs is an established, mature program. So look at and work on your core policies first. Don't try to overdo it, because a year down the road, 2 years down the road, you're going to say, some of this doesn't fit for us. So really focus on your core work, and then build in time to review and revise. And so you want to get the feel for, I know we developed our HACIA advocate program back around 2013. And when we were developing it, we created some forms to do some of the work that we did. And a year to 2 years later, we made revisions to them because they worked to get us what we needed at the time, but they weren't as good as we really wanted them to be. So we made changes. So you want to build in that time periodically to review. And in the beginning, you're going to review a little bit more frequently. Don't start changing forms once a month or something like that. That's going to make everybody crazy. But if you say, okay, we're starting now in January, and in July, we're going to do a comprehensive review, see how these forms are working, or to see how this policy is working, or something like that, and we're going to tweak it. Then at 1 year, another 6 months down the road, you do it again. Then in 2 years, so you see in this little timeline here that it's a little bit stretched out. The longer you've been doing it, the less frequently you need to do. As you become a mature program, you should have a steady pattern of regularly reviewing. So that, you know, like I've got that 5-year mark, I would want at least every 5 years to do a comprehensive review of what we're doing, and maybe spread it about, like, you know, on the every 5 years, we're reviewing the policies. And then 2 years after that, we're reviewing our forms or some other procedures, so that you aren't having to do everything all at once. Next slide, please. So also the impact on your program. So you want to really think about the survivors, how you're hearing from survivors. So build in opportunities to get feedback from those you serve, because you're sitting there, you're making up stuff. Some of the staff might that you have in place might have been a previous survivor of domestic or sexual violence, and they're bringing in good experience for starting off. But as you go forward, you want to hear from those you're serving that are actually experiencing the program, that can give you some feedback. We also know over time, conditions in the work change. I've been doing this work for 40 years, and what we were doing 40 years ago has changed. There's some core things we continue to do, and there are some ways we've changed along the way. And so you want to make sure you're hearing from survivors on a regular basis to inform your work. And so there's a few examples there on the slide, such as experience surveys that you can do. You know, you'd want to set up a periodic time to send out surveys to anybody you have served. So you're not asking them, here on exit, fill this out, unless you have an anonymous return process. So it can go in a way that come back, so it's not being looked at and say, oh yeah, Jane said this and that about us. We want to make sure people have anonymous options to give that feedback through the surveys. So you know, you could use a Survey Monkey online and say, you know, as a part of leaving, you're going to be we're going to be exiting you out of the program in the next few days. Can you complete the survey? And then make sure it's set up to where it comes back in anonymously. Or you have someone outside of the organization monitoring the Survey Monkey. And then focus groups. You can have a meeting and say, so we're starting to see some issues. What do you think about it? How do you think, you know, would be some good ways to respond to that? What are some of the needs for someone experiencing this kind of situation? Suggestion box can be put in the office as well. And then informal comments, and then a formal program evaluation, where you can have some outside person come in and review your work and talk to survivors without coming back and telling you directly what the survivor said about the program. But that person who does the evaluation rolls it into into the report you get back and the findings or recommendations and stuff that you get back on how to strengthen your work. Next slide, please. I always love quotes. Anybody who knows me knows I like to put quotes in different kinds of things. And so this particular quote, I'm going to read it. It's probably my most favorite quote. We are the epitome of our ancestors. They are always right here. I sit at the table with them regularly. They are right here watching me, guiding me, reminding me that I am a woman of my people. And the person's anonymous. And this particular quote, the reason I love it so much is that as we do this, as Indigenous people creating responses for our relatives that have been harmed from violence, it's hard work. It's really, really hard work. And we are doing sacred work for survivors that is such important work. And it can take its toll on each of us. And knowing that we are not doing it alone, that our ancestors are walking with us, they are sitting with us, they are guiding us, is a powerful thing to be able to help us as we're building the kinds of responses we want to see for those that have been harmed by domestic and sexual violence. Putting in place a new program is a hard piece of work. It can feel daunting in the sense that we are not, we don't know. So, some people who are stepping into it, it's like, yeah, maybe I've been an advocate before, and now I'm creating a program and laying all of this stuff out. And we feel like, well, I don't know if I know enough. So it can be really hard. And we, I came into this work as a survivor of domestic and sexual violence 40 years ago. And I have since developed multiple programs over the years. And when I was working on developing American Indian Community Housing Organization back in '93, so a long time ago. But I had been working in non-Native programs and made the decision that we needed, myself and two other women, we made the decision that we needed to have Native specific programming for our relatives in our community. And we worked in different ways. One person was a tribal leader within her tribe, and then another person was a Native woman that worked in a housing program. And then myself, who had been doing advocacy, and the three of us got together and started laying the foundation to build a program. And we did it. We did it. We stopped and prayed periodically. We organized a feast actually a few feasts to get help from our other Native people in the community. And we were never alone. We were never alone. It was powerful, important work that we did. And back in '93, we didn't know if the program would last. And that program has been around now. It still exists. So, and it's doing really great work, which is pretty cool. So I just really hope that for those of you that may be stepping out into doing some of this work or in the early stages of it, just know that you're never alone. Your ancestors are with you. Other Native relatives can be with you as well. Next slide, please. So we're towards the end, and I just wanted you to know that our contact information is here, and just if anybody's got any questions, you can drop a question in the Slack. You can raise your hand as well. I don't know if you can see that if they raise their hand. So if you have a question, drop it in the Slack or the chat, and I can respond to that. And then at the very least, you can reach out to me. My email is on the slide. And then if you have a bigger question where you want to talk some bigger stuff through, beyond an email. You can say that in an email. That's one way, or you can do a request for technical assistance, which basically means that in the request for technical assistance is that we can we can respond back to you, set up a meeting, talk with you. Some of our technical assistance responses, we do a lot of them through Zoom, and we have worked with programs or groups of people developing responses for our urban Native relatives, and they have lasted multiple times in contact. I have one program I've been working with right now that has been going longer than a year to help them walk forward in their work. Our technical assistance is free and available to you because we're funded through a grant through the Office on Violence Against Women. So that grant pays for our time to work with those that want the help that we have. So, Hanovi, are there any questions that came in?
No. But we do have a bunch of people thanking you for the presentation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you all being here. And please feel free to reach out if we can help you. Thanks, everybody. I'll turn it back to you, Hanobi.
All right. Thank you, Vicky. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel within the next few days. You can also find our previous recordings there from all of our different grants. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenter, Vicky. I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. We hope you stay safe, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.